Few video game franchises really sum up the chaotic ambivalence of the internet at large better than the SCP universe. The SCP Foundation, abbreviated for Secure, Control, and Protect, is a fictional paramilitary secret society which works with various national governments in order to safely capture, relocate, and study extraterrestrial and interdimensional creatures and objects, most of which possess inherently supernatural and oftentimes highly dangerous powers. The SCP Foundation project in real life started out as a community crowdsourced wiki site, with thousands of users working together to create an enormously extensive compilation of lore. The SCP Foundation website sprung to life over 14 years ago, on January 19, 2008, and since then over 6,600 different SCPs have been exhaustively documented and observed, all for the sake of science, of course. I can't say I ever really got all that involved or invested into SCP lore. Around that time I was way more into Slenderman lore than SCP stuff, but I do massively respect the idea of so many separate individual people working together to create a somewhat cohesive universe of interconnected stories, artwork, doctored photographs, etc. All to keep the fun alive and going. In many ways, the SCP community for the past decade and a half has, in a very small way, represented the massive potential for collaborative storytelling and community building that the internet as a tool can uniquely provide. I preface this video as saying all that because odds are, if you've been on the internet for at least the past decade or so, odds are you, at some point, have at least heard of something SCP related. Most likely its first notable video game adaptation, SCP Containment Breach, where you play as a researcher attempting to escape the facility, due to a bunch of the more dangerous SCP occupants breaking out of their containment units. As a result, the gameplay of that initial game focused heavily around you sneaking around or running away from your opposition, with the SCPs very cleverly getting in your way in an often frustrating number of ways. Many of the SCP-inspired games that would follow in later years often followed a similar template, focusing on survival, stealth, or puzzle-solving elements. SCP Pandemic, however, breaks away from this established formula by instead opting for a completely different tactical FPS-driven approach, at least in theory. SCP Pandemic is designed primarily as a 4-player cooperative multiplayer experience, although a separate PvP mode that supports up to 16 players is included in the game. Additionally, there is technically a single-player mode, although in reality it's just an identical clone of the main co-op multiplayer experience. The developers haven't even bothered to rebalance the single-player version of the map in order to offset the absence of other players. Were you hoping to play with bots, or bare minimum hoping that the AI director would correspondingly reduce the total number of enemies in each scripted large-scale encounter? Well, you'd be completely wrong on both counts, because the AI director takes absolutely none of that into consideration. In fact, I'm not even certain there actually is an AI director orchestrating all this in the first place. It may just be entirely scripted and the developers have been too lazy to craft a separate single-player, rebalanced version of the original multiplayer map. If you have a game that only has 1 or 2 maps, it might make more sense to manually rework all this rather than program in an AI director, which would take far more time. But if you are aiming to produce several maps one after the other, it might make more sense to have a single overarching AI director take care of all those considerations for you, as well as taking into account additional factors like the player's actual skill, as well as factoring in whether it's only one player or a full team. The maps themselves are fairly decent looking. While the overall setting of most of these SCP games seem to always be the same type of generic looking underground government base, the map here in SCP Pandemic, because of course all the game has right now is one single map, it's all well rendered. As far as Unreal Engine 4 goes, the developers here definitely aren't pushing the engine to its limits by any stretch of the imagination. But all the custom assets used here appear to be relatively high quality, at least if you're not including the zombies themselves, and before some SCP lore nerd decides to call me out on this, yes, I know the game technically doesn't call them zombies. But likewise, I'm pretty sure other games like Call of Duty and Killing Floor 2 come up with their own name variations too. But at the end of the day, that doesn't change the fact that almost every normal person would call them zombies. These zombies look god-awful. We're talking almost Unreal Engine Marketplace asset level bad. And the combat is frankly horrendous. While I was playing alongside some other random players, we were holding out against a scripted event where a horde of zombies would come running at us. This happens a good 3 or 4 times over the course of the map, but then 2 of the guys on our team ran out of ammo, and because the game is extraordinarily stingy when it comes to ammo resupply opportunities, but conversely is more than generous when it comes to zombie hordes, with the third unwanted factor being the fact that all the enemies are very bullet spongy, likely because the hit registration I suspect is wildly inconsistent. You can and often will find yourself running out of ammo even if you're doing exactly what it is you're supposed to be doing. And what makes this even worse is that, to the best of my knowledge, there is no melee option. I've tried spamming basically every button on my keyboard and even later took a look at the options menu, and inexplicably there is no apparent quick melee option, which is absurd and borderline inexcusable for any FPS game to not have some kind of melee kill, or at least some kind of basic knockback shove. If you run out of ammo at any point, you quite simply cannot play the game. You cannot contribute to the team in any capacity, so you're basically better off just letting the zombies flail at you until you lose your remaining health and die. Luckily, whoever programmed them made them so slow that if you just endlessly sprint around, they'll never touch you. One aspect I do feel the game did a rather decent job on was the weapon attachment system. There are a ton of different scopes, grips, and other attachments that will allow you to tweak your weapon mostly however you want. There are some obvious limitations owing to the game's supposed adherence to realism, zombies notwithstanding, but nevertheless I quite liked it. The objectives here in the game are extremely basic and unimaginative, and oftentimes are very poorly communicated to the player. I'm somewhat reminded of Alien Fireteam Elite in this regard, where everything was extremely rinse and repeat, where the whole game revolved around a singular loop of run to this location, then hold your ground for a specified period of time, and then guess what, run to a new location and do the exact goddamn thing. At least in Alien Fireteam Elite, a game I heavily criticized due to that simplistic loop, it allowed you a certain amount of tactical choice in how you approached these scripted events. You could lay down sentry guns and certain traps to use the environment to your advantage. You could effectively limit the number of directions that the AI could attack you from, or at least thin out their ranks in that one direction, allowing you to pay more attention to the heavier wave coming from the other side. Here in SCP Pandemic, however, you don't have those kinds of tools to make the combat flow more interesting. Instead, you just fire away with your gun until you inevitably run out of ammo. Here, the HUD doesn't even make it clear what exactly you're supposed to do once you get to the specified area. There was a moment in the level where we were supposed to be holding out while one person extracts a data drive or something from the server farm, but the game would never make it clear where we were supposed to go to get that item. And since every one of those static server props looked exactly the same, this created a fair amount of confusion within our team. We ended up wasting about 10 minutes or so running back and forth trying to figure out exactly where we were supposed to stand, breaking off every 10 or 15 seconds to shoot a few more zombies along the way. The game's performance was middling throughout. I'm running this off a NVIDIA 2070 RTX GPU, which should be more than enough in most cases to run even extremely demanding games at a decent enough frame rate. But I noticed many instances of the frame rate lowering below 60 FPS at times. And it's not like these levels should be all that demanding. For the most part, they're all just mostly empty corridors and large rooms, only partially occupied by static objects. This is not a game like World War Z, for example, where the game is generating the models, animations, and physics for hundreds if not thousands of zombies at a time, which can be a hefty load for any GPU. I'm sure over time the game's performance will naturally improve, since pretty much any developer, all but the most entirely incompetent developer, can easily remedy performance concerns. It's one of, if not the easiest thing to fix in the game, but since it hasn't been satisfactorily addressed yet, I'm bringing it up here. I know in other videos when I mention something like this, I'll get at least one person screeching into the wind about how this is an early access game and the developers will fix things in due time, I've just got to be patient. I'm sorry, but no. Early access isn't an excuse to cut corners and put out a shitty, sloppy game. If you go on to improve the game over time, that's great. Honestly, that is. That's what people like me want to see from an early access game. Owning up to and fixing your mistakes is an admirable quality. But that does not undo the fact that you made those mistakes to begin with. It doesn't excuse or undo the sorry state of the game when you first released it and began charging people money for it. The second you start charging people money for a game, that gives them the right to criticize said game if that game isn't meeting their expectations. Overall, for the life of me, I cannot recommend SCP Pandemic at this price, or frankly any price. Even if the game went free to play this very day whenever this video goes live, I still wouldn't go back and play it, because frankly, even in the free to play market, there are literally dozens if not hundreds of more fun games for me and my friends to enjoy. Maybe a year or two from now, the developers can rework and refine this game into something somewhat enjoyable, but the odds, quite frankly, are not in their favor. As ever, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to click the like button and comment below what you think of the game. I might not have really enjoyed SCP Pandemic, putting it mildly, but maybe you feel differently, and if so, I'll be curious to hear why. Also, comments really help my videos get boosted in the algorithm, and plus I read and respond to nearly all the comments I get, so even if it's So even if you want to just drop a comment to say hi or get my opinion on something even if it's unrelated, I'll be more than happy to chat with you down below. Likewise, subscribing and clicking the bell really helps. I know it's cliche, but the YouTube algorithm is a pain in the ass to deal with, doubly so as a small channel. This is Warrior Dan signing out. Stay awesome everybody, stay safe, and peace out.